stone. One of the many interesting things about this job is the way we had to set it out. As it's a pediment and it's running uphill, instead of doing everything in 90 degrees, we've had to alter every angle that runs up the hill, so from the ground it looks like it's going straight up. So instead of having a 90-degree angle here, we've got an acute and an obtuse angle. That acute and obtuse angle reflects the moulding here. That has to be compacted and shortened, whereas on this side it's elongated and stretched, so it looks vertical from the ground. Even the rosettes on the pediment have had to be altered. This side has been elongated and this side has been squashed. So every member on this panel has to be individually altered just to get the overall effect when you look straight up from the ground.
The many masons who built the Australian Museum had only their hand tools and horses and carts. Although some of the stones, such as the rosettes, continue to be carved in the traditional way by hand, the machinery and technology available today speeds up some of the more straightforward mechanical tasks. The stones for the Australian Museum restorations are brought individually from the yard to the site and lifted by crane.
Each stone weighs about 1.1 tonne, so the team needs to be very careful when placing the stone because the weight makes it hard to manoeuvre. What they do is chisel the new stone so that it creates a firm hold with the mortar. This is called roughing up the stone. The mortar is made from 6 parts sand, 1 part cement and 1 part lime. The stonemasons found when carrying out these conservation works that the old stones were leaning on the decorative elements underneath. As this could cause breakage with the unnecessary pressure it placed on these elements, the stonemasons corrected this by making sure no mortar or weight was placed on these decorative pieces this time round.
Normally we've got a solid apex stone, but on this particular building they've mitered 2 stones into the apex. So normally we'd bed the apex stone and the 2 stringers either end and then bring string lines through to those 3 points, but because it's mitered, we've had to bring individual stones up, trying to keep on a corbel, 15 mils off our corbel here. And what's happened, once we've come up with this stone, we've found we're a little bit out, so we're trying to adjust that top apex stone plus this stone here, so that when our next stone goes into closed, then it'll be a bit squarer and we'll have the right measurements.
Masons throughout the years have left memoirs of their time. This mason has placed our $2 coin at the apex.
What they are doing now is making the final adjustment using the block and tackle, as the stone needs to be laid on a particular angle.
How's the chain's got to come up or down?
The stonemason then taps the stone into place or saws out some of the mud.
Back up a touch.
The placing of the final stone after 15 months on site is indeed cause for the masons to cheer.
As manager of the state government's stone conservation program, I know I can talk on behalf of all of the heritage professionals and stonemasons that have been working on this building. We all feel it's a wonderful privilege, but also a great responsibility to be undertaking this work.
Proofing the sandstone against birds and the leadworks are the final steps in protecting the new stonework, and these carvings further against weathering, pollution and deterioration.
These carvings were found to have been so skillfully done with the acanthus leaves that we found that we had to bird-proof them in a way to protect them from the pigeon debris and the pigeons nesting inside of them due to the depth of the carvings. So that was one of the problems we had to solve.
it's predominantly pigeons, which are the main problems because of the waste. They're just prolific with their waste. So what we've got to do here is we tighten this off here, and then once that's all tightened off there, the slack here, we thread either stainless steel wire through there or the high density polyethylene line. It's black line, so it doesn't detract from the building at all. Heritage don't like using the Avi spikes because of the intrusiveness of them. They just detract a little bit from the aesthetics of the buildings. But whereas with netting, from a distance, you can't see it. You know, unless you're actually looking for it, you can't see it.
The lead work is important because it protects the stone. I think without the lead work, your stone, with the salts and the acid rain coming out, it really deteriorates the stone over a period.
Basically, the way we're doing this in size should last, theoretically, at least 100 years, maybe 150, because of the size we're using.
I think by putting the lead on, especially putting the drip, which allows the lead away from the stone, which allows the water not to go on the stone. And it's given I reckon you'd be looking at another up to 100 years lifespan extra on the stone because of the lead work. So I think it's a really essential part of the buildings.
The exterior of the building is substantially intact, and careful reconstruction and repair works, necessitated by the serious decay of some of the masonry, has not compromised the integrity of the building.
It was really amazing to me to see the detail of that magnificent work, what was there from the original building and how the stonemasons have restored that, replaced some areas, fixed up others, so that that facade is really magnificent. It's treating the facade like an important museum object that we conserve through time and skill, and it's truly magnificent.
The Australian Museum not only houses irreplaceable objects, it also houses an irreplaceable stonework facade with highly significant ornate carvings, which I believe we have conserved for future generations and should be conserved from here on.
These old buildings are really important to us. Public Works Master Mason George Proudman had a saying which we all strongly support. George used to say that we need a relationship with our past. These old buildings are like members of our extended family. We need to keep them alive for our future generations.
It's the totality of our built form that gives us a sense of who we are as Sydney-siders, and it's the layering of our buildings and our built form and our architecture that tells us all sorts of things about how we perceived ourselves at different times. So there isn't a good building or a bad building in terms of time frame. It isn't that modern buildings are better than old buildings or old buildings are prettier than modern buildings. What the reality is that if we hold on to the layers, if we hold on to the complexity of the built form, then we have a city that's interesting and exciting to move through and to think about. And different buildings from different time frames give us different lessons about our past.
I think the buildings are pretty good. They've got a lot of character about them, and I think they should be conserved. They're historic to us.
Well, I'm from Holland, and I travel quite a bit through Europe, and normally those buildings, like the Australian Museum, they're made out of marble or granite or limestone, and I'm not familiar with sandstone, and that's why they look like big sandcastles to me, and especially like the Australian Museum, it looks like a big sandcastle to me.
Sandcastle. The Australian Museum. Sandcastle. The Australian Museum.
Historical significance.
Australia's first and oldest scientific and cultural institution. The largest and most intact 19th century cultural complex in New South Wales.
Aesthetic significance.
A complex of rich golden sandstone buildings contributing to the finest streetscape in the city.
Social significance.
Most members of the community are likely to visit it in their lifetime.
Technical significance.
Brave innovation at the time of construction, now housing exhibitions of international repute. The Australian Museum. The Australian Museum was opened to the public in May 1857. The dominant sandstone facade on College Street was designed by the then government architect James Barnett. Although the building rated as one of the most significant buildings of the time, it was not without its critics.
The new wing facing College Street and built at considerable cost as part of the design to be hereafter completed is extremely defective. The edifice is too high and too narrow, the approaches from the street are incommodious, the windows are wrongly placed and faulty in design, and there is, in every part of the building, abundant evidence of the architect's desire to subordinate utility to ornament.
Parliamentary Select Committee Report 1874.
I think every new building, even way back in the 1800s, has had its critics. Because they've been new, they've generated something different to the environment. And that's the story of innovation and change, is that when something different comes in, people are threatened and some people critique it. Over time, everyone becomes much more part of it. The role of public buildings at this period of time was to really represent back to the rest of the community a sense that that these institutions were important, that there was a pride in buildings like this, that we were here for the long term. So James Barnett, in designing the museum, really went out of his way to present a proud building that was solid sandstone, that had a very impressive portico, and of course he designed it to be a much bigger building than actually was built, with massive sort of entrances and steps leading up to the porticos, the entrance to the buildings.
Isn't there also the understanding that a museum is a place of education, and once the convict settlement starts to turn into a place with a lot of free settlers, there's a fear that the new generations are not properly educated, they're not cultured like the European people are, and that we'd better start thinking about how to address that. And one of the ways that that was addressed in the 19th century was through museums, not as a research institution but as an educational institution.
As a sort of symbolic education centre that people would come to discover and explore, and things like that is a really important issue, I think.
Well, when you look at the inquiry that they had into the museum up in the 1870s, I think they took some figures of how many people came through the door, and in one year in the early 1870s it was something like the equivalent of half the population of New South Wales visited the museum, which you'd never get those sort of figures today. You could describe the way people thought about museums in the 19th century as a 3D encyclopedia, where the whole knowledge of the whole world was going to be gathered under one roof. And so they were seen as places for research. They were also seen as great educational institutions. They were seen as places where people who often didn't have access to books, often people didn't have books in their homes, a lot of people actually couldn't read, but they could go to the museum and they could learn about a world that was far, far larger than anything that they had ever understood the world to be before. Given that at the time that the Australian Museum was built, Sydney didn't have a decent sewerage system, it didn't have a decent water supply, it didn't have a town hall, it didn't have decent roads that weren't potholed, it's very, very important to understand that in that context, people nevertheless think that it's important to build something like a museum of natural history.
The Australian Museum predates the Federation of Australia. It has a magnificent cultural legacy collected from the 19th and 20th centuries, yet it's relevant in the 21st century. In the 19th century, museums like the Australian Museum were cabinets of curiosity. People came along to see things from this new land they'd settled, but from also from other parts of the world. In the 21st century, our role has changed somewhat. Now the collections housed by the Australian Museum, a collection of real objects, act as an amazing counterpoint to an increasingly virtual world, a world of the internet. You come here to see real objects, real things. One of the challenges on top of that is in a magnificent historical collection of buildings like this, how we show off our wonderful historic buildings, our magnificent sandstone buildings that are so quintessentially Sydney. We may have the only substantially sandstone museum buildings in the world. One of the really important things about Sydney is its sandstone legacy. It's the fact that it's built on a magnificent Hawkesbury sandstone. Sandstone is so important to Sydney, I think that we at times overlook it, but we should really recognise that as much as the harbour is part of Sydney, so is its sandstone built environment.
When this Barnett wing was completed, the impact it must have had on the colony would have been very powerful indeed. The College Street was just a little more than a goat track with cartwheels going along an unpaved roadway, and you had this magnificent edifice of sandstone with all of the Greek order and the finely carved detail. It must have been a very imposing sight indeed to the